You brought up North Carolina and Miami, and I know there's been chatter with North Carolina, and their situation's interesting now with that board and how they may be tied together with NC State a little bit on some of this stuff. But are you anticipating North Carolina and or Miami jumping in on this too with their own lawsuits?
North Carolina is the wild card. I don't want to say the wild card, but they would be more so than Florida State and Clemson probably. They'd be the most attractive candidate, right? Like if the ACC blew up tomorrow, North Carolina would be the one getting the most calls. Notre Dame is kind of a member, so let's put them to the side for a second. But to the extent that to the extent that academics still matters, and it does technically, North Carolina is an elite public institution. That would matter a lot for the Big Ten. North Carolina is right next to South Carolina and Tennessee. So it's a border state for the SEC. That is something that matters to them. It's a big state. Obviously, you get all the Olympic sports and the basketball program and all that stuff. UNC is a very attractive commodity. So I don't know what they are doing behind closed doors, but if we fast forward for, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is, it's hard to see the ACC in its current existence being there, right? And if Florida State and Clemson are out, I would be very surprised if North Carolina stays. Miami, Virginia Tech, to me, those are kind of some of the NC State. They're kind of in the middle there, where it just depends on how does this look like. If Florida State goes to the SEC, does the Big Ten say, yes, we definitely need Miami because we need a presence there, right? There's so many different ways those cookies could crumble, but to me, Florida State, Clemson, and North Carolina are kind of the top three that if and when this thing implodes, they're going to be the ones heading out the door first.
Yeah. And how likely is it that the SEC or the Big Ten would be ready and waiting if they're able to get out right there? I mean, I'm a Big 12 guy. I'm not naive enough to think like, hey, this is all a potential Big 12 coup here. I mean, I would imagine, especially the Big 10 would want to get into Florida, but I know it has been stressed by many people. Like, hey, it's not like there's an offer out there right now, specifically for one of these schools. So how likely do you think it is that they would get what they want and wind up in one of those two conferences when, it seems like the TV money has dried up at least a little bit, and schools like Oregon and Washington had to take reduced shares to get into the Big Ten?
You're right. So that's an interesting scenario, though, right? Where you could imagine Florida State and Clemson. Okay, let's just spitball a scenario. They go to the Big Ten and don't get a full share, but that's still going to be more money than what they would get in the ACC. So there's a way where that still works out ahead of time financially for them. No, I don't think any of them have offers. If there were those serious conversations that had already happened, we talk about tampering in college football, right? Or, oh my God, somebody contacted our left guard at the end of the world. Oh my God. Okay, now imagine that times a billion. Right. That's what tampering and conference realignment would be. If there's conversations were serious and that got found out, that would be very, very bad. So I don't think there's any sort of invite on the table, but maybe there are some back channel things. You mentioned the Big 12. I would not discount the Big 12 in all of this. I'm sure Florida State and Clemson would rather go to the Big 10 and SEC. And there's 10, 20 million reasons per year for why. However, I think it was the Clemson lawsuit. I've read so many things, it's hard to keep track. But one of the schools argued at one point, if we could get SEC or Big 10 or even Big 12 money to be kind of comparable with that, they included the Big 12 in one of those lines. And you can read as much or as little into it as you want. But I would not completely discount the possibility of one of them in the Big 12. It's not a crazy idea to think that could happen.
Interesting. Okay, so what does success look like for Florida State and Clemson here realistically? Like, I know a settlement obviously is the most likely option here, but what are they looking for out of it? I know that number was floated early on, and I'm going to forget the specific number. It was like north of 500 million that they were saying would be the actual
572.
Cost. There you go, to get out. So what does a number look like that is going to be like satisfactory or a win, quote unquote, for Florida State and Clemson here?
Okay, so let's just take a quick step back and talk about the ranges here. Florida State and Clemson argue that the exit fee shouldn't count. And also, if we leave, we get to keep our TV rights. So to them, they should be able to leave for $0.00. Okay. The other extreme is the ACC, which says, hey, our exit fee matters. Also, we have your TV rights through 2036. So we have all your TV money through 2036. Also, what you're doing has breached contracts and this, that, and the other. Therefore, you owe us, Florida State said it's 572. Let's use that number plus damages. So I don't know what the damages are. Let's round about, okay, $600 million. Somewhere between 0 and 600 million, there's a number. I would put the real floor at 130 or 140 because that's what the exit fee is. I think would be hard to kind of get out of that. So what's the number between really 130 and 600 that makes sense? Can both Florida State and Clemson do 200? Would it be 300? I don't know. You look at some of the ways this has happened in the past. I think when Maryland left, they got out for essentially 50 to 60% of what they kind of might have owed. So if we do that, $270, $300 million, is that it? Is that feasible? Do you have to get private equity involved to pay for it? Can you borrow against future earnings from the Big Ten? I don't know all the logistics and all the details on that, but that's kind of at least some sort of a roundabout number on how that might work.
That's, private equity has been mentioned even by like Florida State themselves, right? I think at one of the board meetings that was public where they were talking about a lot of things right out there in the open. But how does that work with private equity here? Because you talk about another entity that, like, I'm looking at court cases, like this isn't really what I do. And then private equity, I'm like, I know the general idea, but what does that actually mean and look like if that's going to happen with Florida State or Clemson here?
Yeah, Florida State spent a lot of time looking at it. It was called Project Osceola, and I've read 2,500 pages from FSU about it through an open records request sometime in 2024. I don't remember. It all runs together at this point. I think today's Friday, but I wouldn't swear to it. So one way that might work is Florida State could essentially form a new entity, and that entity could license some of the rights in terms of the Seminoles logo and the colors and the name and what have you. And then a private equity company could buy into that and kind of help fund it. So that's kind of just the 3-sentence answer. But there's a lot of issues with that too. A private equity company, I'm sure that the people who do that are very, very nice and wonderful human beings. However, they are not doing this out of the kindness of their heart. They are doing it to make money, and they are very good at it. Okay, so what are you giving up financially to start working with those type of companies, those types of firms? What are you giving up in terms of just your power and your control? Because it's no longer where you're you listen to the board of director or board of trustees, you listen to the president, you listen to the AD, and you're listening to the boosters who are very, very involved and close. Now you've got this company whose vision and goals might not align with yours. Do you look at maybe they see, I'm making up a program. Maybe they see softball here and say, hey, that's great that we win all those games, but we're not making any money. What if we cut softball? Those are the types of issues that you could potentially run into where the goals of a private equity company might not align with the goals of a university, and let alone an athletic department. So I have a lot of questions, and just as a guy who loves this sport, I have a lot of concerns about that potentially, but I'm also not naive enough to think that those conversations haven't happened and won't continue to happen, and that we might end up in that situation someday with some school, some conference, some super league, whatever it is.
Yeah, feels like that's the route that we're headed down. Okay, so one conference related question here that I should have slipped in earlier, but there, some people have speculated about, hey, is there a way to have enough teams be like, all right, if things go the right way with lawsuits, enough teams be like, all right, we're out, the ACC disbands, and maybe that Magnificent Seven, quote unquote, group comes back together in some sort of zombie conference that's kind of trimmed the fat, is a little bit more financially viable for everybody there. Do you see that scenario as maybe likely is even the wrong word, but plausible? Is that a plausible scenario?
I believe the ESPN contract is there has to be either 14 or 15 teams, and I can't remember how they view Notre Dame in there. Excuse me. So could they find a way to rip it up? Maybe. You're looking at, I think it's February of 2025 is when ESPN has according to the Florida State lawsuit, has the option to extend the deal or not extend the deal. So maybe there's a scenario there where they decide at that point, no, we're done. And then things kind of dissolve, and can you spin it off into something? Yeah, maybe. But look at some of the stuff Florida State said and done here in their lawsuits. just yesterday, I read in one of their filings, they said something along the lines of how John Swofford and Jim Phillips, the most recent and then current commissioner, basically steered the ship into an existential crisis, something along those lines. You don't come back from that. You just don't. I don't understand. These are professionals and they can be collegial and all that stuff, and that's great. I don't know how you come back from that. And Clemson's been nicer, but I don't know how you can say, you know what, this is terrible. We went out and then reconcile 2 years later. I don't see that as a particularly viable scenario.
Yeah. All right. Well, finally, what are you expecting timeline wise on this? How long do you think that this ultimately is likely to drag out before we get a real resolution?
So there's a couple kind of dates to watch. The first one is in August. I think it's August 15th, where if you're going to leave the ACC in time for the next academic year, you've got to do it by August 15th. So that's the first day. Do I think things will be far enough along then? No, I probably don't. The next one, like I said, is February, and that's the ESPN option. Again, according to the FSU law, the ESPN has the option to extend it or not. Could ESPN say this isn't working? This needs to blow up so we can try and get Florida State or Clemson in a different conference and broadcast their games there? I don't know. And then beyond that, I don't have a good read. I mean, this litigation can be tied up for months or years, and that's certainly a reasonable possibility. But the way things are right now, there's so much going on. Like we could, we've been talking about the ACC stuff, and obviously so, but it's not occurring in a vacuum, right? We have to remember that too, where the SEC is looking at things. The Big Ten is looking at things. The Big Ten's just expanded. The SEC is expanding. How does the SEC like 16 teams? Do they think that this works? Do they think that this is too big? We can't take anymore. There's so many other factors in this as well, where, one thing that happens, the Big 12 sneezes, maybe that affects Clemson and Florida State in the ACC, right? There's scenarios where that happens as well. So long answer to your question, at least months, maybe longer than that.